7 voices broke the stillness of midnight mass on Christmas Eve, 1868. They did not rise in prayer. They did not rise in hymn. They rose in something else entirely. A torrent of sound spilled through the small Georgia chapel, sounds no one present could recognize, sounds that belonged to no known tongue. The congregation stiffened in their pews as candle flames trembled, not from a draught, but as if the air itself had grown uneasy. The speakers were 7 former slaves, emancipated only 3 years earlier. For months they had attended services in silence. They caused no disturbance. They asked for nothing. Until that night, what followed was recorded by 3 men who had nothing to gain from fantasy: the town's minister, its clerk, and a physician summoned in haste. Each wrote independently. Each described the same impossible event, an incident that would fracture the community, ruin lives, and leave behind a question that time itself has failed to answer. What did the 7 actually say? If they were words, they did not behave like words. They surged and receded in strange, deliberate rhythms, patterns that felt older than the chapel walls, older than the town that built them, older than memory itself. And when the voices finally ceased, when silence reclaimed the candlelit room, it was clear something had shifted. Something had been unsealed, or perhaps something long forgotten had been recalled. This is not a tale of possession. This is not a story of divine intervention. This is a story about history refusing to remain buried, about trauma finding a voice when silence is no longer possible, about 7 people who had lost their freedom, their families, even their names, standing together and speaking in a language no one could suppress. If you are drawn to the mysteries history tried to erase, to stories where truth lingers just beyond reach, stay with us. Subscribe now, because what comes next only deepens the enigma. Valdosta, Georgia, winter of 1868, was a town still hemorrhaging from the Civil War. 3 years had passed since Appomattox, yet the wounds were far from healed, only hidden, festering beneath forced normalcy. And on that Christmas night, something old reminded the town that the past was not finished speaking. The streets were quieter than they used to be. Fewer men walked them. Fewer voices filled the air. The grand homes on Patterson Street stood like monuments to a world that no longer existed, their paint peeling, their gardens overgrown, their windows dark. The war had taken sons, fathers, fortunes. What it left behind was a fragile piece, a town trying to rebuild itself on the bones of what it once was. The cotton fields that had once made Valdosta prosperous now lay out, worked by men and women who were technically free but economically trapped. The railroad depot, which had once bustled with commerce, now stood mostly empty, its platforms weathered, its tracks rusted in places. And in that fragile piece, the newly freed population, men, women, and children who had been property just years before, were navigating a world that didn't know what to do with them. The Freedmen's Bureau had established an office in town, a small building on the corner of Hill Avenue, where a weary northern agent named Mr. Charles Whitfield tried to mediate disputes, register marriages, and help former slaves find work. But his resources were limited, his authority questioned, and his presence resented by many in the white community. Most of the freed population kept their heads down. Most worked the same land they'd always worked, under contracts that felt uncomfortably similar to the chains they'd been freed from. Most avoided trouble, avoided attention, avoided anything that might remind the white population of Valdoa that the old order was gone. But there were 7 who had started attending services at the First Methodist Chapel on Ashley Street. 7 who sat in the back pews, silent and still, listening to Reverend Thaddeus Carver preach about redemption and grace. 7 who had been invited cautiously by the Reverend himself, a man who believed, perhaps naively, that the church should be a place for all souls. Reverend Carver was 42 years old, a thin man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. He had served as a chaplain during the war, tending to wounded soldiers on both sides, and the experience had changed him. He had returned to Valdosta in 1866 with a conviction that the church needed to be a force for healing, for reconciliation, for something better than the hatred that still simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. His decision to invite freed slaves to worship at the chapel had not been popular. Several families had left the congregation in protest. Others had stayed but made their displeasure known through cold stars and whispered complaints. But Carver had persisted, believing that if the church could not be a place of inclusion, it had no right to speak of Christian love. The 7 who accepted his invitation were recorded in the church ledger with careful penmanship: Abigail, Marcus, Dinah, Samuel, Esther, Jonah, and Cleo, ages ranging from 19 to 43. All had been enslaved on the same plantation, the old Hurove estate, 10 miles south of town. All had been freed in the chaos of Sherman's march through Georgia in late 1864. All had stayed in the area, working as laborers, washerwomen, farm hands, finding what work they could in a town that didn't want them but needed their labor. Abigail was the eldest at 43, a woman with deep-set eyes and hands scarred from years of field work. She worked as a washerwoman now, taking in laundry from the few families willing to pay her. She lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, a structure that leaked when it rained and offered little protection from the winter cold. Marcus was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his face marked by a long scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of a punishment he had received years ago for the crime of learning to read. He worked as a laborer, hired by the day to load freight at the depot or repair fences on nearby farms. Denina was 26, quiet and watchful, with a voice so soft that people often had to lean in to hear her. She worked as a domestic servant for a family on Patterson Street, cleaning their home, cooking their meals, caring for their children. She lived in a small room behind their kitchen, a space barely large enough for a bed. Samuel was 31, a man who had been a blacksmith's apprentice before the war and still carried the burns and calluses of that trade. He had tried to set up his own smithy after emancipation, but no one would lend him the money for tools or materials. Now he worked odd jobs, repairing what he could with borrowed equipment. Esther was 22, the youngest woman among them, with a face that might have been beautiful if not for the haunted look in her eyes. She had been separated from her mother and siblings during the war and had never found them again. She worked in the fields, picking what little cotton was still being grown, her hands moving with mechanical efficiency. Jonah was 40, a man who had served as a driver on the Harrow plantation, a position that had required him to enforce discipline among the other enslaved people, a role that had left him isolated and mistrusted. He worked now as a groundskeeper for the cemetery, a job that kept him away from others, which seemed to suit him. And Cleo was 19, the youngest of the 7, a girl who had been born into slavery and freed before she fully understood what either word meant. She worked as a seamstress, mending clothes for anyone who would pay her, her fingers quick and precise, despite the poor light in her cabin. They were unremarkable by all accounts, quiet, respectful. They arrived early to services and left quickly afterward. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't draw attention. Clear as throat, they sat together in the back left corner of the chapel, a space that had become theirs by unspoken agreement, and they listened to Reverend Carver's sermons with expressions that revealed nothing until Christmas Eve, 1868. The days leading up to Christmas had been unusually cold. A hard frost had settled over Valdoa, turning the ground iron hard and coating the bare trees with a thin layer of ice that glittered in the weak winter sunlight. The town had made an effort to celebrate. Wreaths hung on doors. Candles appeared in windows. The general store displayed a few modest toys and ribbons, but the cheer felt forced, a performance of normalcy in a place still haunted by loss. Reverend Carver had spent the week preparing for the Christmas Eve service. He had decorated the chapel with pine branches and holly, their scent filling the small space with a reminder of life, even in the dead of winter. He had practiced his sermon, choosing his words carefully, wanting to speak of hope without ignoring the pain that so many in his congregation still carried. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, he had visited each of the 7, as was his custom. He brought them small gifts, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a warm scarf, and wished them a blessed Christmas. They had thanked him quietly, their gratitude sincere but restrained, as if they had learned long ago not to expect kindness and were still adjusting to receiving it. None of them had given any indication that anything unusual was about to happen. The chapel was full that night. Nearly every pew was occupied, families crowded together, their breath visible in the cold air despite the small stove burning in the corner. Candles lined the windowsills, their flames casting long shadows across the wooden pews, making the space feel both intimate and vast. The air smelled of pine and wax and the faint musk of wool coats damp from the evening's drizzle. Reverend Carver stood at the pulpit, his voice steady and warm as he spoke of the nativity, of hope born in the darkest season, of light breaking through. He spoke of Mary and Joseph, of their journey, of their faith in the face of uncertainty. He spoke of the shepherds, of how the divine had been revealed first to the lowliest, to those whom society had overlooked. His words were carefully chosen, meant to comfort, to inspire, to remind his congregation that even in their darkest moments they were not forgotten. The congregation listened, some with heads bowed, others with eyes closed, a few with expressions of quiet skepticism. The seven sat in their usual place in the back left corner. They were dressed in their best clothes, garments that were clean but worn, mended in places too thin for the cold. Abigail wore a dark shawl over her shoulders. Marcus sat with his hands folded in his lap, his scarred face impassive. Dina stared at the floor. Samuel's jaw was tight as if he were holding something back. Esther's eyes were distant, unfocused. Jonah sat very still, barely breathing. Cleo's hands trembled slightly, though whether from cold or something else no one could say. It was just past midnight when it began. The church clock, an old piece that hung on the wall near the pulpit, chimed 12 times. The sound echoed through the chapel, each strike seeming to hang in the air longer than it should. Reverend Carver paused in his sermon, waiting for the C hymns to finish, a small smile on his face as if acknowledging the arrival of Christmas Day. And then Abigail stood. It was not a gradual movement. One moment she was sitting still and silent, and the next she was on her feet, her body rigid, her hands gripping the pew in front of her with such force that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were open but unseeing, staring straight ahead at something no one else could perceive. Her mouth opened and sound poured out. It was not English. It was not any language that anyone in that chapel recognized. It was a series of syllables, guttural and rhythmic, rising and falling in a cadence that felt almost musical but entirely alien. The sounds seemed to come from deep within her, as if something buried had finally found a way to the surface. Amakosi Mwayu, as foe. The congregation turned, startled, confused. A few people half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to approach or flee. Reverend Carver stopped mid-sentence, his hand raised as if to quiet her, his face draining of color. Before anyone could react, Marcus stood beside her. His movement was just as sudden, just as mechanical. His mouth opened and the same sounds emerged, his voice deeper, but perfectly synchronized with Abigail's. Then Dinina, then Samuel, then Esther, then Jonah, then Cleo. One by one, all seven rose to their feet, their voices joining in a chorus that filled the chapel with a sound no one there had ever heard. It was not chaotic, it was not random, it was perfectly coordinated, as if they were reciting something they had rehearsed 1,000 times, as if the words, if they were words, had been waiting inside them, dormant, until this precise moment. The rhythm was hypnotic, relentless. The syllables repeated and varied, forming patterns that felt intentional, structured, like a chant or a prayer or an invocation. The seven spoke in perfect unison, their voices overlapping and interweaving, creating harmonics that seemed to vibrate in the walls of the chapel, in the floor, in the very air. The congregation froze. Some later described it as a language. Others said it was gibberish, nonsense syllables strung together, but everyone agreed on one thing: it was synchronized. The seven spoke as one, their voices rising and falling together, their breath coordinated, their timing flawless. Reverend Carver tried to speak, to call out to them, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt a pressure in his chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. The candles flickered, their flames bending as if pushed by an invisible wind, though the air in the chapel was still. A woman in the third row screamed. The sound broke the spell for a moment, and several people scrambled to their feet, pushing toward the doors. But most remained frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from the 7 figures standing in the back of the chapel, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization. The chant continued for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in that frozen chapel. The syllables grew louder, more insistent, building to a crescendo that seemed to fill every corner of the space, pressing against the walls, against the ceiling, against the people huddled in their pews. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The 7 sat down in perfect unison, their movements smooth and coordinated as if controlled by a single will. Their faces were blank, their eyes unfocused, as if waking from a dream. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, broken only by the sound of someone sobbing quietly in the front row. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The candles continued to flicker, their flames slowly steadying. The smell of wax and pine seemed suddenly overwhelming, cloying. Then, a woman screamed again, louder this time, and the spell broke. People surged toward the doors, pushing and shoving, their faces twisted in fear and confusion. Within minutes, the chapel was nearly empty, families fleeing into the cold night, their Christmas celebration forgotten. Only a handful remained. Reverend Carver, still standing at the pulpit, his face pale and his hands trembling. Dr. Horace Langford, the town physician, a man of 50 with silver hair and a reputation for calm rationality. Mr. Edmund Tate, the town clerk, a meticulous man in his 30 seconds who always carried a notebook, and Mr. Silas Brennan, a deacon of the church, a stern man in his 60 seconds who had fought in the war and prided himself on his unshakable composure. And the 7 still sitting in the back pew, their faces blank, their breathing steady as if nothing had happened. Dr. Langford was the first to approach. He moved slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a wounded animal. He knelt beside Abigail, taking her wrist gently, feeling for her pulse. It was steady, normal. He looked into her eyes, checking for signs of distress or illness. Her pupils were normal, responsive. He asked her a question, his voice low and calm. "Abigail, can you hear me?" She blinked slowly as if waking from a deep sleep. Her eyes focused on him, confused. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "I can hear you. Do you know where you are?" "In the chapel, sir. Do you know what just happened?" She stared at him, her confusion deepening. "No, sir, I don't remember. We were listening to the Reverend's sermon." And then she trailed off, her brow furrowing. "I don't remember, Doctor." Langford moved to Marcus, then to each of the others in turn, asking the same questions, performing the same examinations. Their pulses were normal, their breathing was steady, their eyes were clear. None of them showed any signs of illness, intoxication, or deception. And none of them remembered standing. None of them remembered speaking. None of them remembered anything. After Reverend Carver began his sermon about the Nativity, Edmund Tate had been taking notes throughout, his hand moving quickly across the pages of his notebook, capturing every detail he could observe. He had written down phonetic approximations of the sounds the 7 had made, trying to capture the rhythm, the structure, the patterns he had heard. Silas Brennan stood near the door, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had seen many things during the war, things that had tested his faith, his sanity, his understanding of the world. But this was different. This was something he couldn't categorize, couldn't explain. Reverend Carver finally found his voice. He stepped down from the pulpit and approached the 7, his expression a mixture of concern and bewilderment. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice. "Do any of you feel ill? Do you need anything?" They shook their heads, their confusion evident. Abigail spoke for them, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're sorry, Reverend. We don't know what happened. We didn't mean to disrupt the service." "You didn't disrupt anything," Carver said, though his words felt hollow even to him. "I just want to make sure you're all right." They assured him they were, though their eyes told a different story. They were frightened, confused, uncertain of what had just occurred. They gathered their coats and scarves, moving slowly as if their bodies were not quite their own, and left the chapel together, disappearing into the cold night. The four men who remained stood in silence for a long time, each lost in his own thoughts, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Finally, Dr. Langford spoke. "I've never seen anything like that."
"Nor have I," Tate said quietly, looking down at his notes.
"But whatever it was, T was not random. There was structure to it, pattern, intention." "Intention?" Brennan said sharply. "You think they planned this?" "I don't know what I think," Tate admitted, "but I know what I heard, and what I heard was not chaos. It was organized." Reverend Carver sank into a pew, his head in his hands. "What are we going to tell people?" he asked. "What are we going to say happened here tonight?" No one had an answer. By morning, the entire town knew. Stories spread like wildfire, exaggerated, distorted, each retelling adding new details. Some said the seven had spoken in the voice of the devil. Others claimed they had been possessed by the spirits of the dead. A few whispered that it was a curse, a punishment for the sins of the town, for the sins of slavery, for the sins of the war. Mrs. Adelaide Hutchkins, a widow who lived on Patterson Street and had been in the chapel that night, told her neighbors that she had seen the seven's eyes turn completely white, that their voices had sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once, that the temperature in the chapel had dropped so suddenly she could see her breath. Mr. Jeremiah Cole, a shopkeeper who had fled the chapel in the initial panic, swore that he had heard the sound of drums beneath the chanting, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from the earth itself. Miss Harriet Dawson, a schoolteacher who prided herself on her rationality, admitted to her sister that she had felt something in the chapel that night, a presence, a weight, something that had made her skin crawl and her heart race. The stories grew wilder with each telling, and by noon on Christmas Day, half the town believed that something demonic had occurred in the First Methodist Chapel. Reverend Carver tried to calm the hysteria. He held a town meeting 2 days after Christmas, standing before a packed room in the courthouse, his voice from lack of sleep. Ad spent the past 2 days visiting families, trying to reassure them, trying to explain what had happened in rational terms, but his own uncertainty undermined his words. "What we witnessed," he said carefully, "was unusual. I will not deny that, but I do not believe it was evil. I believe it was a manifestation of grief, of trauma, of something we do not yet understand." His words did little to soothe the crowd. A man in the back, Thomas Ridley, a farmer who had lost 2 sons in the war, shouted that the seven should be removed from the town, that they were a danger, that their presence was an affront to decent Christian people. A woman, Mrs. Beatrice Harmon, whose husband had been killed at Gettysburg, demanded that they be examined by a priest. Snorts that someone with spiritual authority determine whether they had been possessed. Another voice, that of Mr. Nathaniel Cross, a merchant who had prospered during the war by selling supplies to both sides, called for them to be locked up, quarantined, kept away from the rest of the population until it could be determined what had happened to them. Dr. Langford stood and spoke next. He was a man of science, respected in the community, and his testimony carried weight. He had served as a surgeon during the war, had seen men die from wounds that should have been survivable, had seen others survive injuries that should have been fatal. He had learned to trust observation over superstition, evidence over fear. "I examined each of them immediately after the incident," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I found no signs of illness, no signs of intoxication, no signs of deception. Their vital signs were normal. Their mental faculties appeared intact. Whatever happened, they were not in control of it. I believe it was a form of hysteria, a psychological phenomenon brought on by stress or fear." But even as he spoke, doubt flickered
in his eyes.
He had seen hysteria before during the war. He had seen men break under the strain of battle, had seen them weep uncontrollably, scream in terror, lose the ability to speak or move. But this was different. Hysteria was individual, chaotic, unpredictable. What he had witnessed in the chapel had been collective, synchronized, structured. Edmund Tate, the town clerk, was the last to speak. He was a meticulous man known for his attention to detail, for his ability to organize information, to find patterns in chaos. He had taken notes during the event. had written down everything he could observe, and he had spent the past 2 days reviewing those notes, trying to make sense of them. He read them aloud now, his voice flat and clinical, as if he were presenting evidence in a legal proceeding. The sounds they made followed a pattern, he said. Repetitive syllables, consistent rhythm, no deviation. The 7 spoke in perfect unison, their timing synchronized to within a fraction of a second. The syllables formed clusters, groups of 3 or 4 sounds that repeated with variation. It was not random. It was structured. Structured how? Someone asked from the crowd. Tate hesitated, choosing his words carefully like a language. The room erupted, voices overlapped. Accusations flew, fear turned to anger. Some demanded that the 7 be questioned, interrogated, forced to explain what they had said and why. Others insisted that they be expelled from the town, sent away before they could cause more harm. A few voices, quieter, more hesitant, suggested that perhaps they should be left alone, that perhaps what had happened was not their fault. Reverend Carver tried to restore order, but it was too late. The damage was done. The town had made up its mind. The 7 were dangerous. The 7 were a threat. The 7 needed to be dealt with. The meeting ended in chaos WI. No resolution, no plan, only fear and anger and confusion. The 7 were not arrested. There was no law against what they had done, no crime that could be named, but they were ostracized. Employers refused to hire them. Neighbors refused to speak to them. Shopkeepers refused to sell to them. They became ghosts in their own town, invisible and unwanted, moving through the streets like shadows, their presence acknowledged only through averted eyes and whispered conversations. Abigail lost her laundry clients. Marcus was turned away from the depot when he showed up for work. Dinah was dismissed from her position as a domestic servant, told that her services were no longer needed. Samuel found that no one would hire him for odd jobs. Esther was told not to return to the fields. Jonah was informed that the cemetery no longer required his services. Cleo's sewing clients stopped coming to her cabin. Within a week, they were destitute, surviving on what little they had saved, on the charity of the few who were brave enough to help them, mostly other freed slaves, people who understood what it meant to be cast out, to be blamed for things beyond their control. Reverend Carver tried to intervene. He visited the 7, bringing them food, offering them what support he could. He spoke to members of his congregation, pleading with them to show compassion, to remember the teachings of Christ, to recognize that fear was not a justification for cruelty. But his words fell on deaf ears. His congregation dwindled. Families who had attended services for years stopped coming. Donations to the church dropped. He received anonymous letters, some threatening, others simply expressing disappointment that he would defend those people. He began to realize that his position in the community was precarious, that his insistence on treating the 7 with dignity was costing him the respect and support of the people he had served for years. But he couldn't let it go. He couldn't accept that what had happened in the chapel was simply hysteria or coincidence. He had seen the 7's faces. He had heard the sounds they made. He had felt something in that moment, something he couldn't name, something that defied explanation. He began to investigate quietly, methodically, speaking to anyone who might have answers. Second, CTA, narrated naturally. This is the kind of story that refuses to let go. If you want more mysteries like this, stories that challenge what we think we know, hit that like button and let us know you're here. Your support keeps these forgotten histories alive. In the weeks that followed, Reverend Carver became obsessed. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't accept that what he had witnessed was simply hysteria or coincidence. Sleep eluded him. He would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom, replaying the events of Christmas Eve in his mind, trying to understand what had happened, what it meant. He began to investigate quietly, methodically, speaking to anyone who might have answers. He started with the 7 themselves. He visited each of them in their homes, small drafty cabins on the outskirts of town, structures that offered little protection from the winter cold. He brought them food, blankets, whatever he could spare, and he asked them about their past, their experiences, their memories. At first, they were reluctant to speak. They had learned long ago that sharing too much could be dangerous, that revealing too much could be used against them. But Carver was patient, gentle, persistent. He assured them that he was not there to judge, not there to accuse, only to understand. Slowly, over the course of several visits, they began to open up. What he learned disturbed him. All 7 had been on the Harrow plantation during the final months of the war. All 7 had witnessed the same event, the death of Nathaniel Hargrove, the plantation owner, in December 1864. Hargrove had been a brutal man, even by the standards of the time. He was known throughout the county for his cruelty, his temper, his willingness to inflict punishment for the smallest infractions. He had inherited the plantation from his father in 1850 and had run it with an iron fist, believing that fear was the only effective means of control. He had been a large man, over 6 feet tall, with a thick beard and cold gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to instill fear. When he walked through the quarters, people fell silent. When he entered a room, people averted their eyes. But in the final days before Sherman's army arrived, something had changed. He had become erratic, paranoid, convinced that his slaves were plotting against him. He had started carrying a pistol at all times, had posted guards around his house at night, had begun interrogating people randomly, demanding to know what they were planning, what they were hiding. On December 20th, 1864, he had gathered all of them in the barn, over 30 people, and forced them to watch as he executed a man named Elijah, one of the oldest and most respected members of the enslaved community. Elijah had been 63 years old, a man who had been born into slavery and had spent his entire life on the Harrow plantation. He had been a leader among the enslaved population, a man people turned to for advice, for comfort, for guidance. He had been known for his quiet dignity, his refusal to be broken, his ability to maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. The reason for his execution, according to witnesses, was that Hargrove had caught him praying. Hargrove had burst into Elijah's cabin late one night, accompanied by 2 overseers, and had found him kneeling on the floor, his hands clasped, his lips moving in silent prayer. Hargrove had flown into a rage, accusing Elijah of witchcraft, of trying to curse him, of conspiring with the others to bring about his downfall. Elijah had tried to explain that he was simply praying, that he meant no harm, that he was asking God for strength and guidance, but Hargrove wouldn't listen. He had dragged Elijah out of his cabin, through the quarters to the barn, and had forced everyone to gather and watch. He had made Elijah kneel in the center of the barn in the dirt surrounded by the people he had lived with, worked with, prayed with for decades, and then Harrow had raised his pistol and shot him in the head. The sound of the gunshot had echoed through the barn, through the quarters, through the night. Elijah had fallen forward, his body crumpling, blood pooling beneath him. No one had moved. No one had made a sound. They had all stood there frozen, watching as Harrow holstered his pistol and turned to face them. "Let this be a lesson," he had said, his voice cold and flat. "Your prayers mean nothing here. Your God has no power here. I am the only authority you need to fear." Then he had walked out of the barn, leaving Elijah's body where it lay, and had ordered the overseers to make sure everyone returned to their cabins and stayed there until morning. 3 days later, Hargrove was found dead in his study. The official cause was a heart attack. Dr. Langford, who had been called to examine the body, had noted that Harrow was overweight, that he drank heavily, that he showed signs of chronic stress. A heart attack was not implausible, but there were whispers that never made it into any official record, that his body had been found in a strange position, his mouth open, his eyes wide as if he had been trying to scream, that his face had been contorted in an expression of terror, that there had been no signs of struggle, no signs of violence, nothing to explain why a man who had been alive and healthy just hours before was suddenly dead. The whisper suggested that perhaps Elijah's prayers had not been as powerless as Harrow had believed, that perhaps there were forces at work that Harrow had not understood, had not respected, had not feared enough, but these were just whispers, easily dismissed, easily forgotten in the chaos that followed. Sherman's army arrived 2 days after Harrow's death, and the plantation was abandoned. The enslaved population was freed, and they scattered, some heading north. others staying in the area trying to build new lives from the ruins of the old. Reverend Carver pressed the 7 for more details. Had they been present when Harrove died? Had they seen anything unusual? Had they heard anything, felt anything, noticed anything that might explain what had happened? They all said the same thing. They didn't remember. The days after Elijah's death were a blur. They remembered the execution. They remembered the fear, the grief, the sense of helplessness. They remembered Sherman's soldiers arriving. They remembered being told they were free. But the time in between was gone, erased, as if their minds had chosen to forget. Carver didn't believe in coincidences. He began to suspect that whatever had happened on Christmas Eve was connected to that night in 1864. But how and why now? 4 years later, he decided to visit the old Harrove plantation to see if he could find any clues, any evidence that might help him understand. The plantation was 10 miles south of Valdosta, accessible by a rooted dirt road that wound through pine forests and abandoned fields. Carver borrowed a horse from a parishioner and rode out on a cold afternoon in late January.
The sky gray and heavy with the promise of rain.
The plantation house had burned during Sherman's march, and what remained was a blackened skeleton, its walls crumbling, its floors rotted through. The barn where Elijah had been executed still stood, though its roof had partially collapsed and its doors hung askew on rusted hinges. The quarters, the small cabins where the enslaved population had lived, were mostly gone, reclaimed by the forest. Their wood scavenged for firewood or building materials. Carver dismounted and walked through the ruins, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory, by the weight of suffering that had occurred here, by the lives that had been lived and lost in this place. He made his way to the house, stepping carefully over fallen beams and piles of rubble. The study Harrove study was still partially intact, its walls blackened but standing, its floor littered with debris. Carver searched through the wreckage, sifting through charred papers and broken furniture. He was about to give up when he found it. A leather-bound journal, scorched but readable, tucked beneath a fallen beam. The journal belonged to Nathaniel Hargrove. The entries were erratic, paranoid, filled with rants about betrayal and conspiracy. Harrove had written about his slaves, about his belief that they were plotting against him, that they were using some form of dark magic to curse him, to bring about his downfall. But one entry, dated December 19, 1864, the day before Elijah's execution, stood out. They think I don't know. They think I don't hear them, but I do. Every night in the quarters they gather. They speak in their heathen tongue, the one the old man taught them. Elijah leads them. He thinks he can curse me. He thinks his words have power. Tomorrow I will show him how powerless he truly is. Carver's hands trembled as he read. The old man, who was the old man? He tucked the journal into his coat and rode back to Valda, his mind racing. That evening he visited the 7 again, this time with a specific question. Who was the old man, he asked. The one Harrove wrote about, the one who taught you a language. At first they were silent, their faces guarded, but finally Abigail broke. His name was Kofi, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He was brought over on a slave ship when he was a boy. He was the oldest among us. He remembered things, stories, songs, words from his homeland. He taught us not to curse anyone, to remember, to hold on to something that was ours. What happened to him? Carver asked. He died, Abigail said, her eyes filling with tears. 2 weeks before Elijah, Hargrove worked him to death in the fields. He was old, too old to be doing that kind of labor, but Harrove didn't care. Kofi collapsed one day and he never got up again. Carver felt the pieces falling into place. Kofi had taught them a language or fragments of one from his homeland. Elijah had used it to lead prayers to give the enslaved community something Harrove couldn't take away, something that was theirs alone. And when Hargrove killed Elijah, he had tried to erase that last piece of resistance, to silence that last voice of defiance. But he hadn't succeeded. What were you saying that night? Carver asked. On Christmas Eve. Do you know? Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. Grief, perhaps, or longing, or something deeper. We don't remember speaking, she said, but if we did, maybe we were finishing what Elijah started. Maybe we were saying the prayer he never got to finish. Dr. Langford, meanwhile, had begun his own investigation. He was a man of science, trained to observe, to analyze, to seek rational explanations for phenomena that others might attribute to. Oh, the supernatural. He refused to accept that what he had witnessed defied explanation. He started by researching cases of glossolalia speaking in tongues, a phenomenon documented in religious contexts for centuries. He wrote to colleagues in Atlanta, in Charleston, and Richmond, asking if they had encountered similar cases, if they had any insights into what might cause such a phenomenon. The responses were varied. Some dismissed it as hysteria, a psychological reaction to stress or trauma. Others suggested it might be a form of epilepsy, a neurological disorder that could cause involuntary vocalizations. A few mentioned cases of religious ecstasy where individuals claimed to speak in divine languages, though these cases were typically individual and spontaneous, not collective and synchronized. But the more he read, the less convinced he became that this was a simple case of religious ecstasy or psychological disorder. Glossolalia was typically spontaneous, individual, and incoherent. What he had witnessed was synchronized, collective, and structured. He began to suspect that there was something else at work, something that couldn't be explained by existing medical or psychological theories. He reached out to a colleague at the University of Virginia, a professor of linguistics named Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch had studied indigenous languages, African dialects, and obscure linguistic phenomena. Langford described the event in a detailed letter asking if Finch had encountered anything similar, if he had any insights into what the seven might have been saying. Finch's response came 3 weeks later. It was brief, almost curt. Did anyone record what they said? Langford realized with a sinking feeling that no one had. The event had been so shocking, so unexpected that no one had thought to write it down in the moment. All they had were memories, and memories, as Langford knew, were unreliable, subject to distortion, to embellishment, to the influence of fear and confusion. He returned to Edmund Tate, the town clerk, hoping that Tate's meticulous notes might contain something useful. Tate showed him the pages he had written that night, filled with phonetic approximations, attempts to capture the sounds the seven had made. Langford copied them carefully, transcribing Tate's notes into his own handwriting, and sent them to Dr. Finch. The response came 3 weeks later. Finch's letter was longer this time, more detailed, but also more uncertain. I cannot identify the language with certainty. The phonetic structure does not match any known dialect I have encountered in my research. However, the pattern suggests intentionality. The syllables form clusters, and those clusters repeat with variation which is characteristic of language rather than random vocalization. This was not gibberish. This was not hysteria. Someone taught them this. The question is who and why. Langford felt a chill run down his spine. Taught them. Who could have taught them a language that no one recognized, a language that didn't appear in any linguistic database, a language that seemed to come from nowhere? He shared Finch's letter with Reverend Carver, and the two men met in Carver's study to discuss their findings. Carver showed Langford the journal he had found at the Harrow plantation, and together they pieced together the story of Kofi, of Elijah, of the prayers that had been silenced, and the resistance that had been crushed. But why now? Langford asked. Why did this happen 4 years after Elijah's death? Why on Christmas Eve? Carver didn't have an answer, but he had a theory. Trauma doesn't disappear, he said slowly. It stays with us, buried, waiting. Maybe what happened on Christmas Eve was a release. Maybe the seven had been carrying this for years, and something about that the setting, the time, the atmosphere triggered it. Maybe they were finally able to express what they had been holding inside. Langford considered this. It was plausible. He had seen soldiers return from the war with invisible wounds, with memories that haunted them, with experiences that they couldn't articulate. He had seen men wake screaming from nightmares, had seen them flinch at loud noises, had seen them struggle to reintegrate into civilian life. But this was different. This was not individual trauma. This was collective, and it was synchronized. There's something else, Carver said, pulling out another page from Harrow's journal. Listen to this. He read aloud from an entry dated December 22nd, 1864, the day after Elijah's execution. I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them. The words, the sounds, they echo in my mind. Relentless, maddening. I see Elijah's face, his eyes, the way he looked at me before I pulled the trigger. There was no fear in his eyes, only certainty, as if he knew something I didn't, as if he had won even in death. Carver looked up at Langford. Harrow was haunted by what he had done. He couldn't escape it. Maybe the 7 are haunted too. Maybe they're carrying not just their own trauma, but Elijah's, Kofi's, everyone who suffered on that plantation. Langford nodded slowly. It was a compelling theory, but it still didn't explain the synchronization, the structure, the precision of what had occurred. We need to speak to Dr. Finch in person, Langford said. We need him to come here to interview the 7 to analyze this more thoroughly. If anyone can make sense of this, it's him. Carver agreed, and Langford sent another letter to Finch, this time with an urgent request for him to travel to Valdosta. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived in Valdosta in early February, traveling by train from Virginia. He was a man in his 52nds, tall, bendy, thin, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He carried with him a leather satchel filled with books, notebooks, and recording equipment, a photograph that he hoped might capture the sounds if the 7 could be induced to speak again. Langford and Carver met him at the depot and brought him to Carver's home, where they spent the evening discussing the case, sharing their findings and planning their approach. Finch was skeptical at first. He had encountered many cases of supposed linguistic phenomena that turned out to be nothing more than hysteria or fraud. But as he reviewed Tate's notes, as he read Hargrove's journal, as he listened to Carver and Langford describe what they had witnessed, his skepticism began to waver. This is extraordinary, he said finally. If what you're describing is accurate, this could be one of the most significant linguistic discoveries of the century. A language preserved through oral tradition, passed down through generations of enslaved people, hidden from their oppressors. It's remarkable. The next day, Finch began his interviews. He met with each of the 7 individually, asking them about their memories, their experiences, their knowledge of Kofi and the language he had taught them. The interviews were slow, painstaking. The 7 were hesitant, wary of this stranger who asked so many questions, who seemed so interested in things they had tried to forget. But Finch was patient, gentle, respectful. He explained that he was not there to judge, not there to exploit, only to understand. Slowly, over the course of several days, they began to open up. Abigail remembered Kofi teaching them songs, simple melodies with words that sounded like nothing she had ever heard before. She remembered the way his voice would soften when he sang, the way his eyes would close, as if he were somewhere far away. Marcus remembered Kofi telling stories, tales of his homeland, of the people he had left behind, of the life he had been torn from. He remembered the sadness in Kofi's voice, the longing, the grief that never quite left him. Dina remembered Kofi teaching them words, simple phrases, greetings and blessings and prayers. She remembered practicing them in secret, whispering them to herself at night, holding on to them like treasures. Samuel remembered Kofi's insistence that they remember, that they not let the language die, that they pass it on to their children and their children's children. He remembered Kofi saying that as long as they remembered, they would never be truly lost. Esther remembered Elijah taking over after Kofi died, leading them in prayers using the words Kofi had taught them. She remembered the comfort those prayers brought, the sense of connection, the feeling that they were part of something larger than themselves. Jonah remembered Harrow's rage when he discovered what they were doing, the fear that had gripped the quarters, the knowledge that they were being watched, that any misstep could be fatal. Cleo, the youngest, remembered very little. She had been only 15 when Elijah was killed, and the trauma of that night had blurred her memories. But she remembered the sound of the gunshot, the sight of Elijah's body, the silence that had followed. Finch took meticulous notes, recording everything they said, asking follow-up questions, probing gently for details. He asked them to recall any words or phrases they remembered. any sounds or syllables that Kofi had taught them. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to piece together fragments. The language, he determined, was likely a dialect from the region that is now Ghana, possibly Akan or Gar. Though there were elements that didn't quite fit, variations that suggested either a diff, rent dialect, or a creolization that had occurred over generations. He asked them if they would be willing to try to speak the language again, to see if they could recall the words they had spoken on Christmas Eve. They were reluctant, frightened by the idea, but Finch assured them that he would be there, that Carver and Langford would be there, that they would be safe. On a cold afternoon in mid-February, the 7 gathered in Carver's study. Finch set up his photograph, adjusting the horn, preparing the wax cylinder that would record their voices. Carver and Langford sat quietly in the corner, watching, waiting. Finch asked them to close their eyes, to relax, to try to remember the night of Christmas Eve. He asked them to recall the feeling, the atmosphere, the moment when they had stood and spoken. For a long time, nothing happened. The 7 sat in silence, their eyes closed, their breathing steady. Then, slowly, Abigail began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant, as if she were reaching for something just out of reach. But then the words came, the same syllables, the same rhythm, the same cadence that had filled the chapel on Christmas Eve, Amakosi Nyameo. One by one, the others joined her. Their voices overlapped, interweaving, creating the same harmonics, the same patterns. It was not as loud as it had been in the chapel, not as overwhelming, but it was unmistakable. Finch's eyes widened. He leaned forward, listening intently, his hand moving quickly across his notebook, capturing every sound, every nuance. The chant continued for nearly a minute, then slowly faded, the voices trailing off one by one until only silence remained. The 7 opened their eyes, looking at each other, at Finch, at Carver and Langford. They looked exhausted, drained, as if the effort of speaking had taken something from them. Finch played back the recording, the scratchy sound, D of their voices emerging from the photograph's horn. He listened carefully, comparing it to Tate's notes, to his own transcriptions, to the linguistic patterns he had identified. Finally, he looked up, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. I believe, he said slowly, that what you spoke is a prayer of remembrance. The words are fragmentary, incomplete, but the structure suggests a plea to ancestors, to those who have passed, to not be forgotten. The phrase Amakosi could be a variation of Nkosi, which in some West African languages means chief or ancestor. Nyamedu could be related to Nyame, the supreme deity in Akan cosmology. Asfo might be a form of Asada, which means thanks or gratitude. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If my translation is correct, what you were saying was something like, Ansis, divine spirit, we give thanks. We are not forgotten. We are not lost. We are here. The room was silent. Carver felt tears prick his eyes. Langford sat back, his expression thoughtful. The 7 looked at each other, something passing between them. Recognition, perhaps, or relief, or a sense of completion. It was not a curse, Finch said softly. It was not possession. It was a declaration. A refusal to be erased, a way of honoring those who had been silenced. When Finch presented his findings to the town, the reaction was muted. He held a public lecture at the courthouse, standing before a smaller crowd than had attended the meeting after Christmas. Many people had already made up their minds about what had happened, and no amount of linguistic analysis was going to change that. Some accepted Finch's explanation. They were relieved to have a rational explanation, something that didn't involve demons or curses or supernatural forces. They were willing to believe that the 7 had been carrying trauma, that they had found a way to express it, that what had happened was a psychological and cultural phenomenon rather than something malevolent. Others refused to believe it. They clung to the idea that something supernatural had occurred, that the 7 had been possessed or cursed, that they were dangerous and should be avoided. These people continued to ostracize the 7, continued to refuse them work or assistance, continued to treat them as pariahs. A very few, were moved by Finch's explanation. They began to see the 7 not as threats, but as survivors, as people who had endured unimaginable suffering and had found a way to honor those who had been lost. These people began to reach out cautiously, offering work, offering support, offering a measure of the dignity that had been denied them. Reverend Carver continued to hold services at the chapel. The 7 continued to attend, sitting in the back pews, silent and still. The congregation slowly grew again, though it never returned to its former size. Some families came back, drawn by Carver's persistence, by his refusal to abandon the 7, by his insistence that the church should be a place of compassion rather than judgment. Dr. Langford wrote a detailed account of the case, which he submitted to a medical journal. It was published several months later, sparking debate among physicians and psychologists about the nature of trauma, memory, and collective experience. Some praised his work as groundbreaking, others dismissed it as speculation, but it remained in the medical literature, a curious footnote in the history of psychological phenomena. Dr. Finch returned to Virginia, taking with him the recordings and his notes. He continued to study the language fragments, corresponding with scholars in Europe and Africa, trying to trace the origins of the words the 7 had spoken. He never found a definitive answer, but his work contributed to a growing understanding of the linguistic and cultural heritage of enslaved Africans in America. The 7 slowly rebuilt their lives. It was not easy. The stigma of what had happened on Christmas Eve never fully disappeared, but they found work, found community among other freed slaves, found ways to survive in a world that didn't want them but couldn't function without them. Abigail continued to take in laundry, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, her mind often drifting to memories of Kofi, of Elijah, of the words that had been passed down to her. She never spoke them again, but she remembered them, held them close, a secret treasure that no one could take away. Marcus found work at a sawmill, his strength and skill making him valuable despite the town's prejudice. He saved his money, dreaming of one day owning his own land, of building something that would last. Denina found a position with a Quaker family who had moved to Valdosta after the war. They treated her with respect, paid her fairly, and never asked about what had happened on Christmas Eve. She was grateful for their kindness, for the sense of normalcy they offered. Samuel eventually scraped together enough money to buy a few tools, and he set up a small smithy on the edge of town. Business was slow at first, but gradually people began to come to him, drawn by his skill and his fair prices. Esther married a man from a neighboring town, a freed slave who worked as a carpenter. They moved away from Valdosta, seeking a fresh start in a place where no one knew their history. Jonah continued to work at the cemetery, finding solace in the quiet and the company of the dead, who asked nothing of him and judged him not at all. Cleo continued to sew, her fingers quick and precise, her work sought after by those who could see past the events of Christmas Eve to the skill and artistry she possessed. They remained connected, the 7, bound by what they had experienced, by what they had spoken, by the memory of those who had been lost. They gathered occasionally in secret in one of their cabins, and they would speak the words Kofi had taught them, the words Elijah had prayed, the words that had emerged from them on that Christmas Eve. They never fully understood what had happened. They never knew why they had spoken, why that night, why in that way, but they knew that it had been important, that it had meant something, that it had been a way of honoring the past, of refusing to let it be forgotten. Reverend Carver continued to visit, to offer support, to listen to their stories. He never stopped wondering about what had happened, never stopped trying to understand. But he came to accept that some mysteries could not be fully solved, that some questions had no clear answers. He wrote about the experience in his private journal, reflecting on what it had taught him about faith, about trauma, about the resilience of the human spirit. He wrote about how the 7 had been stripped of everything, their freedom, their families, their dignity, but had found a way to hold on to something that was theirs alone, something that could not be taken away. He wrote about how their voices, speaking in a language that no one recognized, had been a form of resistance, a refusal to be silenced, a declaration that they were still here, still human, still worthy of being remembered. And he wrote about how that night in the chapel had changed him, had challenged his understanding of faith and suffering and redemption, had reminded him that the divine could be found in the most unexpected places, in the most unexpected voices. The town slowly moved on as towns do. The memory of that Christmas Eve faded into rumor and legend. New events, new crises, new concerns took precedence. The war receded further into the past. Reconstruction gave way to new political realities. Life continued, as it always does, but the mystery never fully disappeared. The records remained, Tate's notes, Langford's account, Finch's analysis, Hero's journal. They were filed away in archives, in libraries, in private collections, waiting to be discovered by future generations. And the question remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What really happened in that chapel on Christmas Eve, 1868? Was it truly a psychological phenomenon, a collective release of trauma that had been buried for years? Was it a cultural memory passed down through GE narrations, emerging in a moment of collective consciousness? Was it something else entirely? Something that defied categorization? Something that reminded us how fragile our understanding truly is of the human mind, of memory, of the way the past resists being sealed away. The seven never spoke of that night in public. Whatever they carried from it remained private, almost sacred, for the rest of their lives. And one by one they passed from this world. Abigail in 1891, Marcus in 1895, Denina in 1898, Samuel in 1901, Jonah in 1903, Cleo in 1907. Each death closed another door. Each took with it whatever truths had been learned, whatever meanings had been understood, but the voices endured, the sounds endured, the question endured, and perhaps that is how it was meant to be. Perhaps some stories are not meant to reach a conclusion. Some questions are not meant to be answered. Perhaps their power lies not in resolution, but in the asking, not in explanation, but in awe. What we do know is this: on Christmas Eve, 1868, 7 people spoke in a language no one could identify. They spoke as one, with rhythm and structure, with clarity and intent. These were not random sounds. They carried meaning. The words had been passed down to them by a man torn from his homeland, a man who survived unthinkable cruelty and yet refused to surrender his culture, his language, his identity. They spoke for him. They spoke for Elijah. And in doing so, they spoke for all who had been silenced, all who had been erased, all who had been told their voices held no value. By speaking, they ensured those voices would endure, that those lives would be remembered, that the past would not be buried. The chapel on Ashley Street in Valdosta still stands, though time has altered it. The original pews are gone, replaced by new wood. Candlelight has yielded to electric bulbs. The congregation has changed, shaped by generations, yet some say that on certain quiet nights, when the building is empty and the street outside lies still, you can hear it. A faint echo, a whisper, a sound that does not belong to any known language, a reminder that some voices once raised cannot be silenced, a reminder that the past never truly leaves us, a reminder that we are not forgotten, that we are not lost, that we are still here. If this story stayed with you, if it stirred something, share it. Stories like these deserve remembrance, and if you want more mysteries, history tried to erase, subscribe, and turn on notifications, we'll be here, unearthing the past, one forgotten story at a time.